which simply is, and such an unmediated character is quality, and as reflected into itself, in this its character or mode, determinate being is a somewhat, an existent. The categories which issue by a closer analysis of determinate being need only be mentioned briefly. Quality may be described as the determinate mode immediate and identical with being, as distinguished from quantity to come afterwards, which, although a mode of being, is no longer immediately identical with being, but a mode indifferent and external to it. A something is what it is in virtue of its quality, and losing its quality, it ceases to be what it is. Quality, moreover, is completely a category only of the finite, and for that reason, too, it has its proper place in nature, not in the world of mind. Thus, for example, in nature, what are styled the elementary bodies, oxygen, nitrogen, and similar, should be regarded as existing qualities. But in the sphere of mind, quality appears in a subordinate way only, and not as if its qualitativeness could exhaust any specific aspect of mind. If, for example, we consider the subjective mind, which forms the object of psychology, we may describe what is called moral and mental character as in logical language identical with quality. This, however, does not mean that character is a mode of being which pervades the soul and is immediately identical with it, as is the case in the natural world with the elementary bodies before mentioned. Yet a more distinct manifestation of quality, as such, in mind even, is found in the case of besotted or morbid conditions, especially in states of passion and when the passion rises to derangement. The state of mind of a deranged person being one mass of jealousy, fear, and the like, may suitably be described as quality. Encyclopedia section 91, quality as determinateness which is, as contrasted with the negation which is involved in it but distinguished from it, is reality. Quality is reality. Negation is no longer an abstract nothing, but as a determinate being, and somewhat is only a form on such being. It is as otherness. Negation is only a form on such being, it is as otherness. Since this otherness, though a determination of quality itself, is in the first instance distinct from it, quality is being for another, an expansion of the mere point of determinate being, or of somewhat. The being as such of quality, contrasted with this reference to somewhat else, is being by itself. The foundation of all determinateness is negation, as Spinoza says.
Omnis determinatio est negatio.
Every determination is negative. The unreflecting observer supposes that determinate things are merely positive, and pins them down under the form of being. Mere being, however, is not the end of the matter. It is, as we have already seen, utter emptiness and instability besides. Still, when abstract being is contused in this way, with being modified and determinate, it implies some perception of the fact that, Though indeterminate being there is involved an element of negation, this element is at first wrapped up, as it were, and only comes to the front and receives its due in being for self. If we go on to consider determinate being as a determinateness which is, we get in this way what is called reality. If we go on to consider determinate being as a determinateness which is, we get in this way what is called reality. We speak, for example, of the reality of a plan or a purpose, meaning thereby that they are no longer inner and subjective, but have passed into being there and then. In the same sense, the body may be called the reality of the soul, and the law the reality of freedom, and the world altogether the reality of the divine idea. The world reality, the word reality, is, however, used in another acceptation to mean that something behaves conformably to its essential characteristic or notion. For example, we use the expression, this is a real occupation. This is a real man. Here, the term does not merely mean outward and immediate existence, but rather that some existence agrees with its notion. In which sense, be it added, reality is not distinct from the ideality, which we shall in the first instance become acquainted with in the shape of being for self. Encyclopedia section 92, infra subdivision, section beta, being, if kept distinct and apart from its determinate mode, as it is in being by itself, being implicit, would be only the vacant abstraction of being. In Arabic Aristotelian metaphysics, this is called mumkinat, or these are called mumkinat. In being, determinate there and then, the determinateness is one with being, yet at the same time, when explicitly made a negation, it is a limit, a barrier. Hence, the otherness is not something indifferent and outside it, but a function proper to it. Somewhat is, by its quality, firstly finite, secondly alterable, so that finitude and variability appertain to its being. In being there and then, the negation is still directly one with the being, and this negation is what we call a limit, boundary. A thing is what it is, only in and by reason of its limit. We cannot therefore regard the limit as only paternal to being which is then and there. It rather goes through and through the whole of such existence, the view of limit as merely an external characteristic of being there and then arises from a confusion of quantitative with qualitative limit. Here we are speaking primarily of the qualitative limit. If, for example, we observe a piece of ground 3 acres large, that circumstance is its quantitative limit. But in addition, the ground is, it may be, a meadow, not a wood or a pond. This is its qualitative limit. Man, if he wishes to be actual, must be there and then. And to this end, he must set a limit to himself. People who are too fastidious towards the finite never reach actuality, but linger lost in abstraction, and their light dies away. So he must be at a quantitative limit. Let's say you want 3 PhDs, but you realize one is enough. And he must be at a qualitative limit, and the PhD you gain is interdisciplinary. So you have the qualities you wish you had by 3 PhDs, but you set your limit at one. This is one way to set limits. If we take a closer look at what a limit implies, we see it involving a contradiction in itself and thus evincing its dialectical nature. On the one side, the limit makes the reality of a thing. On the other, it is its negation. But again, the limit as a negation of something is not an abstract nothing, but a nothing which is what we call an other. Given something, an upstarts an other to us. We know that there is not something only, but an other as well, nor, again, is the other of such a nature that we can think something apart from it. A something is implicitly the other of itself, and the somewhat sees its limit become objective to it in the other. If we now ask for the difference between something and another, it turns out that they are the same, which sameness is expressed in Latin by calling the pair aliud aliud, something another. The other, as opposed to the something, is itself a something, and hence we say some other, or something else. And so, on the other hand, the first something, when opposed to the other, also defined as something, is itself an other. When we say something else, our first impression is that something taken separately is only something, and that the quality of being another attaches to it only from outside considerations. Thus, we suppose that the moon, being something else than the sun, might very well exist without the sun. But really, the moon, as a something, has its other implicit in it. Plato says, God made the world out of the nature of the one and the other.
Tu hetero.
Having brought these together, he formed from them a third, which of the nature, having brought these together, he formed them a third, which is of the nature of the one and the other. In these words, we have in general terms a statement of the nature of the finite, which as something does not meet the nature of the other, as if it had no affinity to it, but being implicitly the other of itself, thus undergoes alteration. Alteration thus exhibits the inherent contradiction which originally attaches to determinate being, and which forces it out of its own bounds. How do you extract from taking from one and then making another, and from it a third, taking part in the nature of both? Well, you go to then physics or metaphysics at this point, or you go to physics, and then metaphysics is the explanation of the process. So the explanation was, uh, if I translated it, there was the sun, and from the sun emerged a quantum wave, a radio wave, which began to amass the elements that the sun was creating and may have also been present around the sun in an accretion disk that became Jupiter. And other masses were also set into a spin and they were created. One was what we now call the Earth. A theory goes that the Earth was hit by a large planet, possibly Mars, and from and the earth broke up into parts, and as it began collecting again, it collected into one solid whole, which we call the earth, and also the moon, which is in a geostationary lock to the earth as it appears, so we only see one side of it. Now, the earth and sun, the sun being one, and in this case the earth being two, the third is the moon, and the third, we now know we can walk on as we can the earth, possibly live on. And this is the year 2022. We're sending a mission to the moon once again to make it a place that we return to. and put an orbital in space where we can dock and make our way down. This is the United States and NASA, and many other nations are signed on to the what's called the Artemis Accords. But from the Earth, the moon shines and at night provides a certain light, and in its lighter in its whole phases, provides a light which is similar to the sun, and it also provides a sense of gravity that pulls on the waters of the earth. So it acts like the sun, but it also acts like the earth. So from one and two, a third is there, a Vicis Pisces, or Vicus Pisces, and you have the moon between the two, as it were, uh, which acts as both does. So Plato is explaining how the moon works from some either understanding by observation, some philosophy he received from his grandfather, King Solon, that he may have gotten from the Egyptians, and they from the Atlanteans and on back, or some other way. But this is what he means in that very poetic way that he spoke about it, because in speaking about the sun, the earth, and the moon, you speak about what founded humanity. And so you give them higher qualities than you would. And so they take on a representation of higher realities. Or they take on representation of themselves, but then we should see their quality as being great and mystical and used for our understanding of philosophy. But there is a very physical way that Plato means this as well. So when you read philosophy or you read Plato, as you read the beautiful poetic language, the quality, don't forget that there is a quantity as well. And it seems between the quality and the quantity, there is a third which partakes in the quality and quantity, which we're advised to be like in setting limits. To materialize conception, existence stands in the character of something solely positive and quietly abiding within its own limits, though we also know it is true that everything finite, such as existence, is subject to change. Such changeableness in existence is to the superficial eye a mere possibility, the realization of which is not a consequence of its own nature, but the fact is, mutability lies in the notion of existence, and change is only the manifestation of what it implicitly is. The living die, simply because as living they bear in themselves the germ of death. Encyclopedia section 93. Something becomes an other. This other is itself somewhat. Therefore, it likewise becomes an other, and so on ad infinitum. Encyclopedia section 94. This infinity is the wrong or negative infinity. It is only a negation of a finite. But the finite rises again, the same as ever, and is never got rid of and absorbed. In other words, this infinite only expresses the ought to be elimination of the finite. The progression to infinity never gets further than a statement of the contradiction involved in the finite, viewed as something that it is somewhat as well as somewhat else. It sets up with endless iteration the alternation between these two terms, each of which calls up the other. If we let somewhat and another, the elements of determinate being, fall asunder, the result is that some become other, and this other is itself a somewhat, which then as such changes likewise, and so on ad infinitum. This result seems to be superficial reflection, something very grand, the grandest possible. Be such a progression to infinity is not the real infinite. That consists in being at home with itself in its other, or, if enunciated as a process, in coming to itself in its other. Much depends on rightly apprehending the notion of infinity and not stopping short at the wrong infinity of endless progression. When time and space, for example, are spoken of as infinite, it is in the first place the infinite progression on which our thoughts fasten. We say, now this time, and then we keep continually going forwards and backwards beyond this limit. The case is the same with space, the infinity of which has formed the theme of barren declamation to astronomers with a talent for edification. In the attempt to contemplate such an infinite, our thoughts, in the attempt to contemplate such an infinite, our thought, we are commonly informed, must sink exhausted. It is true indeed that we must abandon the unending contemplation, not however because the occupation is too sublime, but because it is too tedious. It is tedious to expatiate, it is tedious to expatiate, which means to speak or write at length or in detail. It is tedious to expatiate in the contemplation of this infinite progression because the same thing is constantly recurring. We lay down a limit, then we pass it. Next, we have a limit once more, and so on forever. All this is but superficial alternation, which never leaves the region of the finite behind. To suppose that by stepping out and away into that infinity, we release ourselves from the finite, it is in truth but to seek the release which comes by flight. But the man who flees is not yet free. In fleeing, he is still conditioned by that form which he flees. If it be also said that the infinite is unattainable, the statement is true, but only because to the idea of infinity has been attached the circumstance of being simply and solely negative. With such empty and other world stuff, philosophy has nothing to do. With such empty and other world stuff, philosophy has nothing to do. What philosophy has to do with is always something concrete and in the highest sense. What philosophy has to do with is always something concrete and in the highest sense present. Be aware that the sun is far more dense than the earth when we're trying to determine what is concrete. And the barometric pressure of the air likely weighs more than you. No doubt philosophy has also sometimes been set the task of finding an answer to the question how the infinite comes to the resolution of issuing out of itself. This question, founded as it is upon the assumption of a rigid opposition between finite and infinite, may be answered by saying that the opposition is false, and that in point of fact the infinite eternally proceeds out of itself and yet does not proceed out of itself. If we further say that the infinite is the not finite, we have in point of fact virtually expressed the truth. For as the finite itself is the first negative, the not finite is the negative of that negation. The negation which is identical with itself and thus at the same time a true affirmation. The infinity of reflection here discussed is only an attempt to reach the true infinity, a wretched neither one thing nor another. Generally speaking, it is the point of view which has in recent times been emphasized in Germany. The finite, this theory tells us, ought to be absorbed. The infinite ought not to be a negative merely, but also a positive. That ought to be betrays the incapacity of actually making good a claim which is at the same time recognized to be right. This stage was never passed by the systems of Kant and Fichte. So far as ethics are concerned, the utmost to which this way brings us is only the postulate of a never ending approximation to the law of reason, which postulate which postulate has been made an argument for the immortality of the soul. And Hegel challenges God, which ought to be and shouldn't be betrayed by the incapacity of actually making good a claim, which is the infinity or immortality of the soul, which we've been told about. And what if you think the immortality of the soul is a terrifying concept, even if it is true? Well, imagine that the soul is a source of quantum power or even atomic power, that whether or not it remains part of a conscience or consciousness creating algorithm, the body, the mind, etc., culture, it may still work to power the universe, power a sun, power a piece of electricity. So it could be that the immortality of the soul is in its function of being a battery, an energetic reality, not necessarily that consciousness, as we understand it, always exists. Just because there's electricity flowing through doesn't mean that there is a program on top of it offering conscious awareness. It may just be electricity. Encyclopedia section 95, infra subdivision section gamma. What we now in point of fact have before us is that somewhat comes to be an other, and that the other generally comes to be an other. Thus, essentially, relative to another, somewhat is virtually an other against it. And since what is passed into is quite the same as what passes over, since both have one and the same attribute, when looked at to be an other, it follows that something in its passage into other only joins with itself. To be thus self related in the passage and in the other is the genuine infinity. To be thus self related in the passage and in the other is the genuine infinity. What is an example of this? Mother and father join in marriage, and through their union, they produce children. Their DNA remains in the children, and so does the DNA of all of their ancestors, and therefore they've passed into genuine infinity. They, in the sense that they've passed from one to another, are now genuinely infinite. Or under a negative aspect, what is altered in the other, it becomes the other of the other, thus being, but as negation of the negation is restored again, it is now being for self. Dualism, in putting an insuperable opposition between finite and infinite, fails to note the simple circumstance that the infinite is thereby only one of two, and is reduced to a particular, to which the finite forms the other particular. Such an infinite, which is only a particular, is coterminous with the finite, which makes for it a limit and a barrier. It is not what it ought to be, that is, the infinite, but is only finite. In such circumstances, Where the finite is on this side and the infinite on that, this world as the finite and the other world as the infinite, an equal dignity of permanence and independence is ascribed to finite and to infinite. The being of the finite is made an absolute being, and by this dualism gets independence and stability. Touched, so to speak, by the infinite, it would be annihilated. But it must not be touched by the infinite. There must be an abyss, an impassable gulf between the two, with the infinite abiding on yonder side and the finite steadfast on this. Those who attribute to the finite this inflexible persistence, in comparison with the finite, are not, as they imagine, far above metaphysics. They are still on the level of the most ordinary metaphysic of understanding. For the same thing occurs here as in the infinite progression. At one time it is admitted that the finite has no independent actuality, no absolute being, no root and development of its own, but is only a transient. But next moment, this is straightway forgotten. The finite, made a mere counterpart to the infinite, wholly separated from it, and rescued from annihilation, is conceived to be persistent in its independence. While thought thus imagines itself elevated to the infinite, it meets with the opposite fate. It comes to an infinite which is only finite, and the finite which it had left behind had always to be retained and made into an absolute. After this examination, with which it were well to compare Plato's Philebus, tending to show the nullity of the distinction made by understanding between the finite and the infinite, we are liable to glide into the statement that the infinite and the finite are therefore one, and that the genuine infinity, the truth, must be defined and enunciated as the unity of the finite and infinite. Such a statement would be to some extent correct, but is just as open to perversion and falsehood as the unity of being and nothing already noticed. Besides, it may very fairly be charged with reducing the infinite to finitude and making a finite infinite. For so far as the expression goes, the finite seems left in its place. It is not expressly stated to be absorbed. Or if we reflect that the finite, when identified with the infinite, certainly cannot remain what it was out of such unity, and will at least suffer some change in its characteristics, as an alkali when combined with an acid, loses some of its properties, we must see that the same fate awaits the infinite, which, as the negative, will on its part likewise have its edge, as it were, taken off on the other. And this does really happen with the abstract one-sided infinite of understanding. The genuine infinite, however, is not merely in the position of the one sided acid, and so does not lose itself. The negation of negation is not a neutralization. The infinite is affirmative, and it is only the finite which is absorbed. In being for self enters the category of ideality. So, what is a finite compared to an infinite? An infinite is the entire planet Earth and its atmosphere, and a finite would be a human being on the earth. Now, looked at together, the finite is part of and from the infinite. And so, when they're together, which has always been until recently, as far as we know, then the finite and infinite are one. But if the finite leaves, if the human leaves the earth and its atmosphere and goes to the moon, one would argue that the finite has left the infinite, and has it placed enough space between itself and this particular infinite? One, to redefine it as a closed infinite, and to reach another state, either its infinity for a moment outside of the Earth's atmosphere, it as the human as a complete entity is then an infinite to itself, and everything within it are finite. Or do we argue that because, say, that human being lands on the moon, that even though it's out of the infinity of the Earth and its atmosphere, it is still within its gravitational grasp? Well, if we argue that, then we would understand that human is within the gravitational grasp of the Earth for some time, and Jupiter and the Sun and the Sagittarius, a star at the center of our galaxy, and possibly a larger entity that Sagittarius, a star, revolves around. So then the infinity, truly, if we were looking for an infinity, would be gravity. And gravity is defined as a strong nuclear force, I believe. And then there's weak nuclear force, which we call electromagnetism. So electromagnetism and gravity are, we would argue, the true infinite, that all else is finite and within. And so in discussions of God as light and electromagnetism and gravity, gravity is, we're now understanding, as of yesterday, an article, a form of geometry. So electromagnetism and geometry that becomes gravity form an infinity, possibly opposite of each other, where we're all contained within. So this is the example that we're looking at of the various levels of infinity and finite, and the distances between them. If you're looking for the infinite, I would suggest strong and weak nuclear force in the form of electromagnetism, or in the form of strong and weak nuclear force in the form of gravity, which is geometry, and electromagnetism, which we call light. Being, there and then, as in the first instance, apprehended in its being or affirmation, has reality. See Encyclopedia section 91. And thus, even finitude in the first instance is in the category of reality. But the truth of the finite is rather its ideality. Similarly, the infinite of understanding, which is coordinated with the finite, is itself only one of two finites, no whole truth, but a non-substantial element. This ideality of the finite is the chief maxim of philosophy. And for that reason, every genuine philosophy is idealism. But everything depends upon not taking the infinite, what, in the very terms of its characterization, is. But everything depends upon not taking for the infinite what, in the very terms of its characterization, is. Because if electromagnetism and geometry are the infinite, the yin yang of the infinite, then every thought is generated from electromagnetism, and then gravity is what allows it to be manifest outside of the mind. And so here Hegel is arguing that even though we know electromagnetism and gravity, light and geometry are the infinite, we should avoid thinking of them as the infinite, so that we can continue on in our adaptation of information to create things around us, and to move forward and to realize our sovereignty and some other things as well. So he's asking you to demote the truth. At least that's what it sounds like. For this reason, we have bestowed a greater amount of attention on this distinction. The fundamental notion of philosophy, the genuine infinite, depends upon it. The distinction is cleared up by the simple, and for that reason seemingly insignificant, but incontrovertible reflections contained in the first paragraph of this section. What was that first paragraph? What we now, in point of fact, have before us is that somewhat comes to be another, and that the other generally comes to be an other, thus essentially relative to another. Somewhat is virtually another against it, and since what is passed into it is quite the same as what passes over it, since both have one and the same attribute, viz. To be an other, it follows that something in its passage into other only joins with itself, to be thus self-related in the passage, and in the other is the genuine infinity, or under a negative aspect. What is altered is the other, it becomes the other of the other, thus being, but as negation of the negation is restored again, it is now being for self. Now, I paused briefly before I read that paragraph because did Hegel mean this section that we're in, which we call paragraph sections, or did he mean in this section that's called chapter 7? And if he meant in the section that's called chapter 7, then that's Encyclopedia section 84, which says, being is the notion implicit only. Its special forms have the predicate is. When they are distinguished, they are each of them an other, and the shape of which dialectic takes in them, and the shape which dialectic takes in them, in essence, their further specialization is a passing over into another. This further determination or specialization is at once a forth putting, and in that way a disengaging of the notion implicit in being, and at the same time the withdrawing of being inwards. It sinks deeper into itself. Thus, the explication of the notion in the sphere is being, thus the explication of the notion in the sphere of being does two things. It brings out the totality of being, and it abolishes the immediacy of being, or the form of being as such. It brings out the totality of being. This is strong nuclear force, gravity, geometry, and it abolishes the immediacy of being, or the form of being as such, and electromagnetism, some call light. You might want to imagine lightning. So this was the paragraph he likely referred to, which couldn't be explained until we got to the very end of this section, or at least until Encyclopedia section 95. Okay, continuing. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, chapter 7, first subdivision of logic, the doctrine of being, quasi-subdivision A, quality, subsection C, being for self. Encyclopedia section 96, infra-subdivision section Alpha, being for self, as reference to itself is immediacy, and as reference of the negative to itself is a self-subsistent the one. This unit, being without distinction in itself, thus excludes the other from itself. To be for self, to be one, is completed quality, and as such contains abstract being and being modified as non-substantial elements. As simple being, the one is simple self-reference. As being modified, it is determinate. But the determinateness is not in this case a finite determinateness, a somewhat in distinction from an other, but infinite because it contains distinction absorbed and annulled in itself. The readiest instance of being for self is found in the I. We know ourselves as existence, distinguished in the first place from other existence, and with certain relations thereto. But we also come to know this expansion of existence in these relations reduced, as it were, to a point in the simple form of being for self. When we say I, we express the reference to self, which is infinite and at the same time negative. Man, it may be said, is distinguished from the animal world and in that way from nature altogether, by knowing himself as I, which amounts to saying that natural things never attain a free being for self, but as limited to being there and then, are always and only being for an other. Again, being for self may be described as ideality, just as being there and then was described as reality. It is said that besides reality, there is also an ideality. Thus, the two categories are made equal and parallel. Properly speaking, ideality is not somewhat outside of and beside reality. The notion of ideality just lies in its being the truth of reality. This is to say, when reality is explicitly put as what it implicitly is, it is at once seen to be ideality. Hence, ideality has not received its proper estimation. When you allow that reality is not all in all, but that an ideality must be recognized outside of it, such an ideality external to or it may be even beyond reality would be no better than an empty name. Ideality only has a meaning when it is the ideality of something, but this something is not a mere indefinite, just as, but this something is not a mere indefinite, this or that, but existence characterized as reality, which, if retained in isolation, possesses no truth. The distinction between nature and mind is not proper. The distinction between nature and mind is not improperly conceived. When the former is traced back to reality, and the latter to ideality as a fundamental category, nature, however, is far from being so fixed and complete as to subsist even without mind. In mind, it first, as it were, attains its goal and its truth. And similarly, mind on its part is not merely a world beyond nature and nothing more. It is really, and with full proof, seen to be mind, only when it involves nature as absorbed in itself. Apropos of this, we should note the double meaning of the word. Apropos of this, we should note the double meaning of the German word aufheben, to put by or set aside, and in modern translation, cancel. We mean by it, one, to clear away or annul. Thus, we say a law or a regulation is set aside. Two, to keep or preserve, in which sense we use it when we say something is well put by. This double usage of language, which gives to the same word a positive and negative meaning, is not an accident and gives no ground for reproaching language as a cause of confusion. Aloha. We should rather recognize in it the speculative spirit of our language rising above the mere either or of understanding. Encyclopedia section 97, Infra subdivision section beta. The relation of the negative to itself is a negative relation, and so a distinguishing of the one from itself, the repulsion of the one, that is, it makes many ones. So far as regards the immediacy of self-existence, these many are, and the repulsion of every one of them becomes to that extent their repulsion against each other as existing units. In other words, their reciprocal exclusion. Whenever we speak of the one, the many usually come into our mind at the same time, whence then we are forced to ask, do the many come? Whence do the many come? We are forced to ask. This question is unanswerable by the consciousness which pictures the many as a primary datum and treats the one as only one among the many. But the philosophic notion teaches contrariwise, that the one forms the presupposition of the many, and in the thought of the one is implied that it explicitly makes itself many. The self-existing unit is not like being, void of all connective reference. It is a reference as well as being there and then was not, however, a reference connecting somewhat with an other, but as unity of the some and the other, it is a connection with itself. And this connection, be it noted, is a negative connection, hereby the one manifests as utter incompatibility with itself, a self-repulsion, and what it makes itself explicitly be is the many. The one and the many. The one in my family, the eldest name, the eldest ancestor I can look to is His Majesty Pharaoh Ramses III, King of all Egypt, and very likely more than that. He's the one that if you mention him in a recording or a party or somewhere else, he's well known. What is he well known for? Being the son of the Pharaoh who was asked to release the children of Israel so they could then migrate back to the promised land, to Canaan. And that begins the entire episode of Exodus and the writing of the Torah, the Chumash, the books of Moses, and on until today, even to the modern state of Israel. So he's my ancestor. Now, when I think of him, I am aware that I have many ancestors uh, before him and after, but because I, in my 40 years of life, approaching 41, have always heard his name, have always heard about his father and about Moses, and he's so important in the history of our modern world that I can see him there and I can isolate him. But I also know that it is his connection to his father, to Moses, to Aaron, to the courts that the Egyptian monarchies and pharaonic realities that followed him, to the families of the royal families of Europe and Japan and others. It's this great connection that says, well, he lived and he's extremely important, but it was a negative importance. Why? Because his life ended, yet he perpetuated himself through his children and grandchildren and their children, and at that point, cousins and others. And therefore, uh, the one that we look at establishes the many in their importance. uh, without much regard to what those people did with their importance later, though many did well with it and others did less well with it. So that's one way of looking at the one and the many that we're speaking of here. And I always return to royal examples because we're discussing a text that existed within the context of royalty that was very likely written in dedication or even by the sponsorship of a royal person and is intended for people who do separate themselves out from the many as a way for them to see the world, or well, a way for them to see or have sight that is different than the majority of people. If you happen to also gather sight, either you're part of that group or you have a self-validating being for self of your own, based in a one, or maybe you are the one who will create many after you. We may denote this side in the process of being for self by the figurative term repulsion. Repulsion is a term originally employed in the study of matter to mean that matter, as a many, in each of these many ones, behaves as exclusive to all the others. It would be wrong, however, to view the process of repulsion as if the one were the repellent and the many the repelled. The one, as already remarked, just is self exclusion and explicit putting itself as the many. Each of the many, however, is itself a one, and in virtue of its so behaving, this all round repulsion is by one stroke converted into its opposite, attraction. Encyclopedia section 98, infra subdivision section gamma, but the many are one the same as another. Each is one, or even one of the many. They are consequently one and the same. Or when we study all that repulsion involves, we see that as a negative attitude of many ones to one another, it is just as essentially a connective reference of them to each other, and as those to which the one is related in its act of repulsion are ones. It is in them thrown into relation with itself. The repulsion, therefore, has an equal right to be called attraction. Imagine one side of a magnet which will attract another magnet or metal, and another side of a magnet which may repel another magnet but still attract metal. The repulsion, therefore, has an equal right to be called attraction, and the exclusive one, or being for self, the magnetism itself, suppresses itself. because we're only thinking about did it repel this or did it pull it toward it, we forget that, or we negate then that it is all magnetism so we can understand an aspect of it. The qualitative character, which in the one or unit has reached the extreme point of its characterization, has thus passed over into determinateness, quality, suppressed, in essence, into being as quality. When we look at what is called dark energy or dark matter, one could argue that dark energy is electromagnetism and dark matter is almost a universal uh, geometric gravity. And when they, even though we might have a bar magnet which repels and attracts, the force there, or the reality of it, especially if it's connected through electricity to cause it, is that when it becomes dark energy or dark matter, it has passed into determinateness, and we would say the universe has a quantity, yes, of magnetism, electromagnetism, and gravity, but we would now say that the universe is of the quality of electromagnetism and gravity. And that, so here, once again, the qualitative character, which is the one or unit, has reached the extreme point of its characterization, has thus passed over into determinateness, quality suppressed, in essence, into being as quality. Do I have a PhD in uh, physics? No. How am I able to make such a determination? There may be a physicist listening or another who says, we call it dark matter and dark energy because we don't know what it is. Well, because I've followed those discussions for some time, I'm making an argument based in logic as I'm reading that that's what they are. If they turn out not to be, if dark energy turns out not to be electromagnetism, and dark matter turns out not to be geometric gravity, my guess, my theory, my assertion based on logic is the best one we have now, and someone would have to make a better one based on logic to undermine it. So you don't necessarily need to be an expert in the field. You have to have uh, a familiarity, and what will make it truth or fact as we would understand it beyond a logical statement, beyond a theory or a thesis, is to be able to test it. And I do not have the skill to test whether or not dark energy is electromagnetism or dark matter is geometry. So I won't prove it. I'm offering a thesis, and it's a very good one. So someone will go out and prove it, and they'll win the Nobel Prize for it, hopefully after hearing this. And to prove it is just to be logical and use a scientific method and make sure that as you prove it, we find some use for electromagnetic dark energy and some use for geometric gravity dark matter. The philosophy of the atomists, atomists, or the atomists, adamists, is the doctrine in which the absolute is formulated as being for self, as one, kuhulahu ahad, and many ones, Allahu Samad. Uh, this is the 112th chapter of the Quran, which very likely originated in a much older Egyptian manual, the book of Going Thy Way by Night and Day. This isn't an insult at all to the veracity of the Quran, which the belief is that the Archangel Gabriel, an entity, somewhat more infinite entity than others, uh, brought information which he said came from Kitab, from the mother of the book. And mother of phrases are always references back to Egypt. Uh, that's how they're used. And so the book of Going Thy Way by Night and Day, if I were an angel, or let's say, as I am now as a doctor of law, trying to argue for logic to be understood, I'm going to Hegel, which the Hegel, the E's in Hegel are pronounced as A's if they were pronounced in their Latin way, and a Hegel is a blessed wind, another name for an angel. So I'm going to the angel Hegel to understand logic and the philosophy of mind and nature, and then I'm producing an outline which I intend to attach to a much older book of astro astrological findings and the relationships of the Hebrew prophets from my great ancestor, Ramses III, and at least my cousin or great uncle, the prophet Aaron and the prophet Moses, based on DNA. I'm going back to them to present information now that you all may go out and do something else with. It is not strange then that Hegel, I believe, went back to uh, something called the Futuhat Mekkia, the same author that I'm attaching a different book to, even though he argues that he didn't write that book, he received it from somewhere else. He did write the Meccan Revelations. And so Hegel likely brought, I think, almost all of it forward and produced this text, interjecting arguments of others who also negotiated the text as well. Um, an argument, or again, our Aristotle or someone else, the great tradition continues. So the point about the book of Going Thy Way by Night and Day, or the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it's called by some, is that it contained information in it, and sometimes it contained whole poems that were so perfect that if I were an alien being speaking to uh, a man or another alien being who I wanted to bring change the world, I would go and look for a text that has already been that's already worked. So maybe I'm an alien being who's been coming to Earth for thousands of years. So what did I give the last time I met a guy like this? What did we do the last time we did this? Well, we went back to this primary phrase, and it's the 112th chapter of the Quran, which is called ikhlas, or sincerity. And in the case of our reading here, it would be called truth. And it says kul, and kul means behold, or hey, have a look, listen. Often people will say it means say. Kul, then it goes Huwa Allahu Ahad. So he is the primary reality, and he is one. Allahu Samad, he is the primary reality, and he is the self-sustaining sustainer of all others. Lam yalid wa lam yulad, so he does not give birth, nor is he given birth to, and then it goes on beyond that, and by and there is nothing similar to him, uh, and that is the entire current section here is a summary of, or that is a summary of it, that 112th uh, chapter of the Quran, which again is very likely a few thousand years older than when it was brought forward. The philosophy of the atomists is the doctrine in which the absolute is formulated as being for self, as one and many ones, and it is the repulsion which shows itself in the notion of the one, which is assumed as the fundamental force in these atoms, but instead of attraction, it is accident, that is, mere unintelligence, which is expected to bring them together. So long as the one is fixed as one, it is certainly impossible to regard its congression with others as anything but external and mechanical. The void, which is assumed as the complementary principle to the atoms, is repulsion and nothing else. presented under the image of the nothing existing between the atoms. Modern atomism and physics is still in principle atomistic, has surrendered the atom so far as to pin its faith on molecules and particles. In so doing, science has come closer to sensuous conception at the cost of losing the precision of thought. To put an attractive by the side of a repulsive force, as the moderns have done, certainly gives completeness to the contrast, and the discovery of this natural force, as it is called, has been a source of much pride. But the mutual implication of the two, which makes what is true and concrete in them, would have to be wrested from the obscurity and confusion in which they were left even in Kant's metaphysical rudiments of natural science. In modern times, the importance of the atomic theory is even more evident in political than in physical science. According to it, the will of individuals as such is the creative principle of the state. The attracting force is the special wants and inclinations of individuals, and the universal, or the state itself, is the external nexus of a compact. I'll describe this uh, in terms of an atom and then go subatomic with it in the sense of what the atom is composed of. Within an atom, you have the nucleus, and within the nucleus and about it, you have a the proton, a neutron, and electrons, or you have protons, neutrons, and electrons. And please check this. This is the theory of valence and countervalence. But I know that the electrons, as a particular electron approaches the nucleus of an atom, it is said to penetrate it, even though it doesn't actually go into the nucleus. However, when other electrons also try to approach the nucleus of an atom, they are repelled by the sheer force of the one electron that it has penetrated or has come closest to the nucleus. So when this one electron comes very close to the nucleus, uh, it creates a force that repels all other electrons back and puts them in their general orbitals. And some of them are even pushed out to create an ion or to allow the creation of a molecular structure. So this is one of the ways to look at it. And what is Hegel arguing here? And things that have been known since times of the Greeks, so that we can see now with different instruments, or at least have better math for, or have math for. There are things like quarks and others. We have what is now the Higgs boson, which says to be the thing that gives mass to all matter. There are other things that, if you go deeper into it with quantum physics and just the numbers of it, if you go deeper down, the rules change. So Hegel here is anticipating quantum physics, which, and this is within 100 years, a little bit more, when Einstein and others, Niels Bohr and others, were predicting the same thing. By reading Hegel, they came to understand that there may be something more when we can understand the atomic structure, but if we base our entire if we base infinity on it, if we base the entire unity of on the atomic structure, we may not get everything we need to understand about the nature of what is uh, smaller than that atomic structure. Beyond it, and when we understand what's smaller than the atomic structure, then we still have a modern atomist opinion that, oh, in the quantum realm, things are different. In the quantum realm, when you're extremely small, things are different. Well, it's very likely that if in the quantum realm, according to the Hermetic theory, as above, so below, but inversely, that if in the quantum realm things are different, then in the let's say the micro quantum realm things are different. Then in the macro quantum realm, things are very likely the same as they are in the micro quantum realm. So things from the atom up to possibly the planet Jupiter, maybe even the solar system, act similarly, but things that are extremely small or extremely large, they may act very much alike. So this goes back to the concept of yin, which I would consider electromagnetism, and yang, which I would consider geometric gravity. So moving on, the atomic philosophy forms a vital stage in the historical evolution of the idea. The principle of that system may be described as being for itself, in the shape of the many. At present, students of nature who are anxious to avoid metaphysics turn a favorable ear to atomism, but it is not possible to escape metaphysics and cease to trace nature back to terms of thought by throwing ourselves into the arms of atomism. The atom, in fact, is itself a thought, and hence the theory which holds matter to consist of atoms is a metaphysical theory. Newton gave physics an express warning to beware of metaphysics, it is true, but to his honor be it said, he did not by any means obey his own warning. Hear me, Israel, said Maimonides. It is a sin for you not to leave Egypt. However, I have never left Egypt. The only mere physicists are the animals. They alone do not think, while man is a thinking being, حيوان ناطق, or شيء ناطق, and a born metaphysician. The real question is not whether we shall apply metaphysics, but whether our metaphysics are of the right kind. In other words, whether we are not, instead of the concrete logical idea, adopting one-sided forms of thought, rigidly fixed by understanding, and making these the basis of our theoretical as well as our practical work. It is on this ground that one objects to the atomic philosophy. The old atomists viewed the world as a many, as their successors often do to this day. On chance they laid the task of collecting the atoms which float about in the void, but after all, the nexus binding the many with one another is by no means a mere accident. As we have already remarked, the nexus is founded on their very nature. To Kant, we owe the completed theory of matter as the unity of repulsion and attraction, the unity of electromagnetism and geometric gravity. The theory is correct, so far as it recognizes attraction to be the other of the two elements involved in the notion of being for self. So the attracting force or the attracting elemental is very likely the Platonic solid of water, which is a icosahedron, a symbol of an inverse triangle, blue. It has 20 faces, 12 points, and 30 edges. And the Platonic solid or elemental of repulsion is very likely fire, which is a tetrahedron. It is four-sided. It is an upright triangle, red, has four faces, 4 points, and 6 edges. So if you recognize that in the atomist understanding, if repulsion and attraction are the basis of all matter, well, you're only talking about two of the Platonic solids. You've left out air, which is an octahedron, eight-sided, has 8 faces, 6 points, and 12 edges. A hexahedron, which is six-sided, and it's representing of Earth. It has 6 faces, 8 points, and 12 edges. And Aether, which is a dodecahedron, and has 12. It's 12-sided, uh, has 12 faces, 20 points, and 30 edges. And their combination are and when you draw, there's a particular way to combine them and draw lines between them. Uh, and that is called Metatron's cube, and that will be the great unity. So even if matter is fire and water, repulsion and attraction, then matter is not all there is. There is still air, earth, and ether, which are also possible in addition to them. So that's just another way of saying the atomists are only wrong in that they've limited their understanding of what is. They're not wrong in the sense of what they've said. Had they had, so returning to the text, still this dynamical construction of matter, as it is termed, has the fault of taking for granted instead of deducing attraction and repulsion. They take for granted attraction and repulsion. They didn't do what I just did and determine what it is. Had they been deduced, we should then have seen the how and the why of a unity which is merely asserted. So what I just described goes back to the Pythagorean maxim. One, there are strings of electromagnetism, or strings of light, and those there is humming within those strings, and that humming of the strings produces a movement that creates geometric shapes, and those geometric shapes form into the Platonic solids. And the various interactions of the Platonic solids, how does air interact with water, interact with fire, interact with ether, interact with earth, create the universe that we see and don't see around us. And between these varying combinations and repulsions of the Platonic solids, between the spheres, it's said, there is music. That music is thought, whether it be harmonious or noise. But there's music, there is a harmony between them. There is a symphony playing that creates thought that allows us to manifest them. So, in terms of the Hermetic tradition, also is a form of magic. Magic is sufficiently advanced technology that you do not understand, which is indistinguishable from magic, which is a principle that Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, and other books mentioned. Uh, there is a way for thought to manipulate the Platonic solids. That can be in terms of drawing a plan and then having it constructed, or it could be in wearing a pair of uh, sunglasses that record information and through a technology called Bluetooth, transfer it into a micro version or a quantum version of the universe called a smartphone and into a program, and you hear it now. This is a form of magic that I'm engaged in. However, we and electromagnetism is involved, gravity, a number of things are involved, microcompressors, expansion devices, waves. These are all part of it. So this is where everywhere you go, you can draw mysticism from it, or metaphysics, we would say, though it is proper to use speech in such a way to sound sober and only talk about it in terms of what we call scientific speech. So you can be very philosophical on one hand and say this stuff, or you can be very physical and say it. But sometimes in saying it physically, you end up sounding more metaphysical or philosophical than in just reading it, which sounds very truth oriented and law oriented. And it also has a lot to depend on your culture as well. All right, so to continue, Kant indeed was careful to inculcate that matter must not be taken to be in existence per se, and then, as it were, incidentally, to be provided with the two forces mentioned, but must be regarded as consisting solely in their unity. German physicists for some time accepted this pure dynamic, but in spite of this, the majority of these physicists in modern times have found it more convenient to return to the atomist point of view. And in spite of the warnings of uh, Kirchner, Keshner, one of their number, have begun to regard matter as consisting of infinitesimally small particles, termed atoms, which atoms have then to be brought into relation with one another by the play of forces attaching to them, attractive, repulsive, or whatever they may be. This too is metaphysics, and metaphysics which, for its utter unintelligence, there would be sufficient reason to guard against. Encyclopedia section 98, infra subdivision section gamma, infra section 3, which in the text is labeled 2. To transition from quality to quantity, indicated in the paragraph before us, is not found in our ordinary way of thinking.